Okay, guys. So I feel bad since I can't be there with you guys today, and since I pushed you guys really hard on Friday with double notes, and I didn't just want to throw a PowerPoint in front of you and say, okay, here, copy down the notes. I kind of wanted to go over it. So this is my first time creating a screencast, so bear with me. But we're going to go over this. I just wanted to review really quick kind of what we went over on Friday and then move on into today. So pause the video as needed so that you can copy down the notes. But going back to Friday, we started Unit 6. This is the Reform movements. And what we started with was the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening is your religious revival movement. And it differs greatly from the First Great Awakening of the 1600s and the 1700s, in that the First Great Awakening believed that people were inherently bad, people were inherently sinners, that God was angry. And the Second Great Awakening is kind of the flip side of that. That people are inherently good, that people have free will to choose, that God is loving, that people are equal in the eyes of God. And it's that sense of equality that will kind of spawn the rest of these reform movements. People will start to ask themselves, okay, well, how can we improve society? How can we make society better? So, kind of going on down, we talked about Charles G. Finney, one of the leading preachers during this. We talked about Richard Allen and the AME churches, the African Methodist Episcopal churches. We talked about the Mormons, and we'll talk more about them coming back from spring break when they go out west. We talked about the Book of Mormon. I showed you guys Mr. Poindexter's copy of the Book of Mormon. Y'all all got to read the love letter that was in there from an ex-girlfriend. Yep. We talked about the Shakers, how the Shakers, one thing that we get from them is their music. They have a lot of music that other churches will use. And some of you guys, if you ever look at it, you might actually be familiar with a lot of their songs. But moving on down, Transcendentalists. We talked about the Transcendentalists and how they believe that God and nature and man, that's God with a little g, are all connected, that there is divinity in all things. And because of that, they reject a lot of secular authority. They reject organized churches. They reject formal organized religion. They're more spiritual than actually religious. Scrolling on down, we talked about the utopian communities, groups of people that will come together to form communities, sometimes very separate from the rest of society, almost like communes, sometimes a little bit like cults, where they try and form a more perfect society. We talked about the Shakers, the Mormons in some aspects. We talked a little bit about New Harmony, Brook Farm. We talked about Oneida, and that how they created silverware, and you can actually still buy that silverware today. And scrolling on down, we talked about prison and asylum reform. Dorothea Dix was involved in other reform movements, was traveling around the country, and noticed that in a lot of these prisons that she visited, many of the inmates there had not actually committed a crime, but were in fact mentally ill. And so she will push to create asylums to work with the mentally ill and to treat the mentally ill. We talked about the temperance movement, the push to ban alcohol, and how that will eventually lead to the 18th Amendment and prohibition. And we compared it to today with different local laws regarding alcohol and other substances. Scrolling on down. We talked about education reform, how before this, if you were going to be educated, especially highly educated, you had to be wealthy. You had to pay for it. And this is the beginning of your push for free, public, tax-supported schools. Now, keep in mind that these tax-supported schools did not necessarily go up to the 12th grade. Many of them would kind of end around 6th grade. A lot of students would drop out before then. They might be needed at home. Girls would then, once they've learned to read or write, maybe do some basic math, would go home to be educated at home. We talked about Horace Mann. We talked about the McGuffey readers, how this is almost kind of like your first standardized textbook. and that my grandfather, my dad's father, actually had a copy of the McGuffey readers that were still used when he was in school in the 1910s and 1920s, and how it taught the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. And yes, I realize that only one of them actually began with an R. Talked about Noah Webster in the dictionary standardizing American spelling compared to British spelling. Alright, getting into today. Women's reform movement, early 19th century women. A little bit about what life was like for a woman before this. Women were unable to vote. That doesn't come around until 1920 and the 19th Amendment. You have the legal status of a minor your entire life. If you're single, in some states you could own property, especially if you were a widow with a young child, especially a young male child who is too young to control his own property. If you were married, you had no control over your property. You had no legal rights to your children, whatsoever. You could not initiate or file for divorce. Your husband had to leave you. And if he did, he got the children, period. End of story. Remember, you have no legal rights to your children. You could not make a will. You could not sign a contract. You could not even bring a case to court without your husband, your father, your brother's permission. And to give you guys a little bit of background on this, my grandmother, my mom's mother in the 1950s, was in her 20s. Her 20s, and she at that time, women could not buy a house, could not buy a car, could not get a job, especially if they were married, and could not even get a credit card once credit cards started to come out a little bit later, without a male signature, without a male's permission. So sometimes, in some cases, it's not that long ago. Alright, just as a political cartoon from that time period, kind of making fun of the women's rights movement, saying what it would be like if ladies had their own way. So you can see the women are the ones getting into the carriage and going out into society while the men are staying home, sewing, washing, taking care of the baby. Alright, so how does this all start? The women's rights movement will branch off from the abolitionist movement. 1940 in London, they hold a World Anti-Slavery Convention. And 2 American women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, will attend this convention with their husbands, with their families, and while they are there, they will notice that there is a split in abolitions, particularly in a woman's role in the abolitionist movement. And one reason that the women's rights movement will split off and start from the abolitionist movement is because the abolitionist movement, remember, is pushing to get rid of slavery. Some women will start to see themselves as in a form of slavery, especially legal slavery. So, at this time you had something called the separate spheres concept, in which a man's sphere of influence is business, is government, is kind of outside in society. A woman's sphere of influence was her home. And they called that the cult of domesticity. Remember, domesticity, domestic, the home. That her role is to civilize her husband and her family and to educate and raise the next generation of Americans. And I included in there a quote from an 1830s minister that kind of shows this cult of domesticity, the separate spheres concept. It says, "The power of a woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on a man to become a reformer yields the power that God has given her for her protection. And her character becomes unnatural." Pretty much saying that if a woman is a reformer, is pushing for equality, is pushing for legal rights, to reform, it goes against nature, it goes against God. And so some of the women we're going to talk about, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. We'll talk more about them with the abolitionist movement. They'll be very much involved in this. Remember that there is kind of a connection between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. A lot of people who are involved will actually be involved in both. The Lucy Stone will create the American Women's Suffrage Association, and she will edit and write the Woman's Journal, which is a newspaper that's still actually being published today. Some of your moms or grandmothers or aunts might get copies of it. Women in the 19th century. The wealthier you were, the higher you are up in society, your socioeconomic status, the bigger the gap between men and women. If you were wealthy, a woman could afford to stay at home and take care of her family. If you were poor, you are both poor together. You are equally poor, and you both have to work. Women were considered physically too weak and too emotional for a lot of jobs. If you were considered very emotional, girls, you could actually be put in an asylum. But you were considered fine for teaching because, remember, that's part of your role is to raise up and educate the next generation. Went too far. Men were strong but crude if we're not guided by a woman. And then some of the leaders in the women's rights movement, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and that should say Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not Candy Stanton. I got to fix that. Elizabeth Blackwell is your first female to graduate with a medical degree. Margaret Fuller and the Grimke sisters are both big-time reformers for both women and abolitionists. Amelia Bloomer will create, some of you guys might actually be familiar with, it's an old-fashioned term, old-fashioned word, bloomers. They're still around today. They're mostly for little girls, but they go under a skirt to kind of cover her diaper, her underwear. If you're out digging in the dirt, you don't want dirt and sand to go places it shouldn't go. But bloomers are named after Amelia Bloomer, and what it was back then, it was a semi-short skirt. And when I'm talking semi-short skirt, I'm talking like it would hit your knees or your calves. It didn't really go above your knee, so it's not really short by our standards, but it was incredibly scandalous back then. Whew. And underneath those skirts, you wore pants. You had these big kind of baggy, they're called pantaloons, and I'll show you guys a picture of it in a few minutes. So back to the Women's Rights Convention. All right, remember that this was started with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton after attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention. So they come back. They form this Women's Rights Convention, and they meet in Seneca Falls, New York. And they write the Declaration of Sentiments and Rights, which is based very purposefully off the Declaration of Independence. It is worded to be almost identical. It is written to be almost identical to it. It says that all men and women are created equal. It demanded a ballot for women, the right to vote for women. This is going to launch really the women's rights movement. And so moving on to the next slide, all right, showing you guys once again a picture of Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And yes, they are very old in these pictures, but keep in mind cameras were still pretty new and you had to pay to have your picture taken, and you might get your picture taken once or twice in your lifetime. It was kind of expensive, and you had to kind of sit there and hold still for a minute or two. So a lot of pictures, people aren't smiling because it would hurt to smile for 2-3 minutes straight. And so people just have a straight face. Another one we have not talked about, but Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a former slave born Isabella Baumfree in New York. And while she was in New York as a slave, New York will abolish slavery. New York will pass a law that will formally end slavery and make New York a free state. And after that has happened, her owner will illegally sell one of her younger sons down south into slavery illegally. And she will sue her former owner for the legal rights to her child, and she's one of the few women that will sue for the rights to her children and win. She is very famous, once again, in the abolitionist movement and in the women's rights movement. And she would travel around the country giving speeches at different meetings, and she would give this speech called Ain't I a Woman? And I have posted a video on your blend space of Kerry Washington, a famous actress, reading this, and I really encourage you guys to go on there and listen to it. And I have like less than 10 seconds left. So if you got any questions, shoot me an email or come talk to me in between class. All right, and I will see you guys tomorrow.